I welcome you all back, and I now call on Senator Di Natale.
Thank you very much. Mr Burgess, can you tell me what the current value of the tobacco holdings in the Future Fund is?
We use a definition of the MSCI GICS category, and the current value at the 30th of June is $210 million.
Can you also tell me whether there have been additional shares purchased?
Over the period, I think we provided some information to the 14th of February. Over that period, shares have been sold by our managers. And just to be clear, this is all bought and sold at our manager's discretion.
Sorry, can you just elaborate on that point? Since the answer that you provided me on notice, you're saying that there has been shares sold but no new shares purchased?
In aggregate, the number of shares have been sold, so the value has gone down, but also the number of shares have gone down.
But there's also there've been some shares purchased and some sold, but the aggregate is fewer shares. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay. Just a point on, in terms of providing me with the answers to questions on notice, I've asked questions at estimates on a number of occasions on this issue, and every time I've got a response on notice, they've been late. They've been months late. There is a requirement to provide those answers within 30 days, and one of the questions around the value of tobacco is a fairly straightforward one. I would have thought you could provide me with that response within that 30-day period. So can I just, for future reference, just point to that standing order that says that you've got 30 days to reply? The other inconsistency, and I just wondered if you had a response, was I asked you a question in May in terms of the value of the holdings, but you provided me with an answer that was valid as of February. Is there any reason that you didn't provide me with the current value as the time I answered the question, asked the question, or is there any reason for providing me with the answer up until the February period?
Look, no, absolutely not. We're very keen to be transparent on this, and I think we just assumed that the question was around the February period, to be honest. Okay,
all right, just wanted to know that. I want to go to the ESG issue. The question of the ESG policy as the fund applies it is that it emphasises continued engagement with companies through voting rights rather than through direct exclusions. Again, I want to ask you a question I've asked previously, and that is whether you've seen any improvement in any of the tobacco companies that you've invested in as a result of your ESG approach.
I think the questions previously were about the approach of engagement generally. And we believe that engagement does have a very powerful impact. I think it's very clear from the way the corporate behaviour and the approach to corporate governance has improved in not just recent years but over a period of time. And so we are very clear that engagement is a very powerful tool on which to improve corporate behaviour and ensure that they reach the standards that we would expect.
Well, I suppose the question is very specific. I'm asking for just one example. You don't have, not a long list, but just one example of where that engagement has improved the behaviour of any of the tobacco stocks in which we invest. And perhaps it might be helpful if you could define what criteria we use for improved behaviour with the fund.
Look, I might stand corrected here. I don't think previously we were asked specifically about that industry. We're asked generally about the role of engagement and the way in which engagement works, and I think we answered the question. To answer specifically about that industry, I may take that specific point on notice, but generally I would emphasise again that engagement, I think, is a very powerful tool and influence to ensure correct corporate behaviour, and we apply that across all of our industries, and what's more, we expect our managers to do that. And in manager selection, the way in which they engage our environmental, social and governance policy is a very important checkpoint before they're able to work with us as a partner.
I think we both agree that engagement's important. What I'm specifically asking is that given that tobacco is an inherently harmful product and there's no safe use of tobacco, that ultimately it will result in damage to your health if it's used as it's supposed to be used, then what is the criteria for improved behaviour that you're looking at? Just a question on exclusions. Aside from cluster munitions, has the fund ever exercised the option to exclude in relation to a specific company?
The fund, as you know, in February last year revised and re-announced its environmental and social governance policy. At that time, we made changes to our process to improve and enhance, as you do over time. And at that time, we specifically clarified our approach to exclusions, for example. We've been applying that policy throughout this year, and the board of the fund, through its governance committee, has a very active approach at re-engaging that policy to ensure that it is a live policy, that it's constantly being looked at and refreshed. So we engage with companies on a very, very regular basis, and we expect our managers to engage in companies, and that's what we're currently doing.
So I suppose the question is very specific. Are there any examples, apart from cluster munitions, where the fund has exercised the option to exclude, i.e. it no longer invests in that particular industry or company?
You're absolutely correct. The cluster munitions were excluded.
That's right.
But since the February policy, so if the question is during this last year, have any specifically been excluded? No, but we have definitely very significantly engaged with companies, as we do on an ongoing basis.
Is that a reflection of the fact that you expect that your ESG approach is working and that, in fact, the companies you're engaged with are improving?
We would expect companies to improve over time. We do engage with them, as I say, and we expect our managers to engage with them. I think our exclusions on the cluster side show that we have a clear exclusions policy. Yeah, we would expect corporate behaviour to continue to improve. We also expect to be participating in ensuring that we have the correct corporate officers, we have the right fiduciaries managing our investments, and so that happens on an ongoing basis. I don't think measuring in a short period of time how many you've excluded or not, it's not like a football game. I think it has to be very deliberate, very long term, and that's our philosophy. It's the best approach is to engage and improve behaviours over time. But we have a clear policy that if we can't get those outcomes, exclusion is an option.
Okay, well, I agree with you again that I think you need to take a long-term outlook. So let's have a little look at the tobacco industry. You know, United States versus Philip Morris, we had the US District Court judge there quoting that the tobacco industry survives and profits from the selling of a highly addictive product, causes disease, staggering number of deaths, immeasurable human suffering, economic loss, profound burden on our national system, and that tobacco companies have known all of these things for 50 years or more, but they've continued to, and with enormous skill and sophistication, to deny these facts in public. I mean, this is all on the public record. We know that they have lied about the impact of smoking on lung cancer. And this has occurred over 50 years. This is a ruling from a US District Court judge. Given the history, the 50-year history, 50-year plus history of what I think is very, very shameful behaviour and anything but the actions of a good corporate citizen, how do you expect to be able to change that through engagement with the industry?
There's a lot of history there and opinions about the tobacco industry. Perhaps
are you denying that anything I've said is incorrect? This isn't a question of opinion, this is all fact. So you've used the word opinion.
You were talking about the history of the tobacco industry over many decades. You know, I've been with the fund for a year, we have a policy since February, but let's be clear about it. I think what you're talking about is the role of exclusions. How does exclusions work in the fund? What is the approach of the fund when it comes to exclusions? As you're aware, there are opinions on lots of industries and lots of issues out there in the community. And so we have to be very careful in having a very clearly defined exclusions process. And we've discussed this before. We look for a diversified portfolio. We ensure that we're focused on our mandate. We ensure that we allow for risk. We ensure, and this is an important point, that there's no breaking of Australian laws or conventions or treaties. And then we ensure that they follow our ESG policies. And I think that's the most important issue, is to have that framework to ensure that you have a clearly defined approach to the way that you look at exclusions in a portfolio.
Okay, so rather than perhaps documenting the known and established track record of the tobacco industry, let's look at some of the companies that the Future Fund's currently invested in. So we're invested in 15 tobacco companies as of today. As of the 30th of June this year, we had about $57 million worth of shares in British American Tobacco. Now, British American Tobacco gets most of its cheap tobacco from Africa, and in countries like Malawi, for example, British American Tobacco, through its business practices, employ about 78% of kids between the age of 10 and 14 and 55% of 7 to 9-year-olds on tobacco farms for less than 2 cents a day, no protective clothing, malnutrition, nicotine toxicity, kids are subject to abuse if they don't turn up to work on time. And that's all aside from the fact that in Africa, young kids are a very attractive new market for British American Tobacco. So given that $57 million holding, can you tell me how you expect to improve the behaviour of British American Tobacco as a corporate citizen through your engagement?
Look, first of all, I can't comment on specifics that you've just raised. Let me give you an example of our process. If specifics are raised to us about a company, we have a very clearly defined process to review and look at that. We demand that our managers review and look at that, and then we use service providers to review and look at that. And these are specialists in determining the corporate behaviour of companies. In this case, you're using British American Tobacco. If we're presented with examples, as you've just given us today, we will look at that closely and review it to ensure that the company is behaving according to the standards that we expect, the laws, the treaties of Australia and the conventions. And so, you know, I think that's a very well-defined process, and that's the way we approach looking at any investment.
Okay, so let's look at, as of the 30th of June in 2012, the tobacco company that had the highest rate of return that the fund was invested in was the Indonesian company Gedang Garam Tbk. Now, they're the company that makes those lovely clove-smelling cigarettes and the ones with sweet tips that the kids like so much. In Indonesia, the average age for a kid to start smoking is under 10, and we've got about 65 million smokers in Indonesia. The company involved markets very heavily and targets very heavily young kids. In fact, I understand they sponsor schools and so on. Again, we've got several $1 million invested, 50% return, very healthy return, would you agree?
50% return is
Yes.
a good return, that's true.
The question I have again is, given the behaviour of that company, how is that consistent again with ensuring that our ESG policy targets those industries with a poor track record and ensures that we improve that behaviour?
I think today you've outlined a series of views and opinions on the behaviours of companies.
No, these are facts. I've outlined a series of facts about the behaviour that these companies are engaged in.
And as I mentioned, when we're presented with facts, as you've outlined today, we will review them and look at them. And so I will take that on notice and come back to you with a comment on those issues. And that is what you would expect. There are a lot of opinions about companies around. People may have views about a way a company is operating or behaving. The key is to do research. The key is that our managers do research into that, and we use a variety of world-class service providers to assess the corporate behaviour of these companies. I will have to take your discussion on those points on notice, but we will review that for you and come back to you.
I mean, this doesn't require extensive research. Most of this is actually a matter of public record. What about Philip Morris, which is, I mean, if I started talking about the track record of Philip Morris, we'd need a few hours. But they are the gold standard when it comes to denying the link between cigarettes and lung cancer. Systematic history of covering up evidence. They target young kids in their advertising. There have been very clear links demonstrated between pesticide use from that company and major birth defects. We've now got $47 million in Philip Morris with a 15% rate of return. Again, I just want an example of how we're attempting to improve the behaviour of Philip Morris through our ESG approach.
As I mentioned, we would expect our managers to engage with any company that we invest in to ensure that they operate at the standards that we expect. We monitor that very closely. You've given detail today. I would have to take that on notice and come back to you and discuss that or provide that to you on notice.
Do you have, are you optimistic that Australia, through its future fund holdings, and it's, just remind me about the resources, it's got one part-time ESG officer, is that correct?
We discussed this in the last Senate estimates. We have a senior officer that presented at the inquiry into the recent bill. He's extremely well regarded. And then below that, we expect all of our managers, all of our investment partners to have their own ESG people. If we were to add that up, it would add into the hundreds. That's how important that is across the industry. As you know, we're required to use external managers, and therefore we require them to have skilled sets of operatives to be able to implement our ESG policy. In addition to that, we use external service providers who specialise in this field. They monitor and track these companies very closely on a global basis and also here in Australia. And so we have a variety of layers that we use to ensure that the companies meet our standards, and so it's a very deep team. But
just to be clear, in terms of the employees employed directly by the fund, with it, there is one ESG officer?
We have one ESG officer, but to also be clear, we are required to use external managers.
Sure. If
we manage the funds only in-house, we'd have more, because we're able to draw, though, on literally hundreds of ESG-related resources, and including our own specialist resources that we pay direct fees to monitor the ESG environment according to our policies.
So you're optimistic that through the approach you've outlined that we are going to see a change in behaviour within the tobacco industry and within each of the companies I've outlined to you, and specifically the issues around child labour, the issues around denial of evidence, the issues around targeting young children through sweet tips on filters of cigarettes, sponsorship of schools and so on. You're confident that your ESG approach will change all of those things to improve the corporate behaviour of each of those individual tobacco companies?
As I mentioned, if we were presented with any specific issues or facts or sort of allegations, I would call them, then we will review them, and we will review them with our partners and our service providers to ensure that we understand the factors behind that. Moving to the issue, though, of corporate behaviour, there's absolutely no question in my mind that engagement is vital to improve corporate behaviour on a global basis. We see this regularly in a variety of industries where the behaviour of suppliers to the industry, I won't name names here, but you can see this on a regular basis. The reason that the press and the reason that this is so widely covered, I believe, is because institutions like ourselves are watching them closely to ensure that they operate at the standards that we expect.
Your final question, Senator Di Natale.
Look, I'm happy to leave
Finished
it there.
it?
Thank you.
Excellent, Senator.